debriefing. Let's just think about how many of you have actually experienced debriefing. How many of you have done debriefing in the clinical area? Put up your green cards if you have. Okay, keep them there. How many of you that are doing debriefing have attended a formal debriefing course? Okay, so only a red one, good one. Okay, so only a handful of you have actually attended a formal debriefing course. Any volunteers who'd like to tell me what was discussed amongst themselves and what you think debriefing actually is? Put up your green card, put up your hand. Yes, thanks.
So what we discussed to us was taking a case that's happened, whether it's good or bad, and talking about the things that happened during the case. So the good things that happened, bad things that happened. And the main thing from it is putting those together and moving forward. So being able to move forward from a bad situation and learn from it, but also take a good situation and put it into practice again and again to try and better the performance. We also discussed dealing with the emotions that come with the case. So the loss if you lose the patient, or frustration at not having the right equipment to do what you need to do.
Okay, great. Anybody else want to add anything to that? I think you've basically covered it. What debriefing isn't is what I am about to do. Okay. Would you like them, Craig? There you go. Okay, so that's not what debriefing is, but it's exactly what you say. It is reflecting on an experience. Okay, so we are going to reflect on something that has happened, and we're going to have a conversation about that with a view to actually improving our performance. That's basically what debriefing is. And what's quite important about debriefing is that we remember that most people so I'm going to link up debriefing. First of all, you referred to it as a clinical experience, didn't you? Is that the kind of debriefing you were talking about? Okay, so when I talk about clinical, I'm sort of talking about being in the hospital or being at the roadside or whatever, that sort of clinical debriefing, versus a simulation, which is what Rebecca had referred to earlier on. Both of them have certain things that overlap. Both of them are experience-based. Both of them incorporate reflection. Both of them need to elicit response and feelings from the participants. And then we develop strategies with which to work to forge ahead. So what is important is that I'm going to talk about mainly simulation-based debriefing initially, and you'll see that there are overlaps between the two, and then I'll show you a tool that you can use for a clinical debrief. Okay. How many of you are doing clinical debriefs after resuscitation or some kind of adverse event that has happened in your clinical area? Yeah, that's fabulous. That's much more than what I expected. So that's brilliant, really brilliant. And do you have formal debriefers? Or who's got formal debriefers? Okay, so many of you, in other words, are doing debriefing on the spot amongst yourselves. Is that right? Okay, nothing wrong with that. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to show you a video, but before I show you the video, I want to talk about two things. And the first is psychological safety. For any learning to take place, there has to be what we call a safe container, a safe environment. I have to be able to express myself to my colleagues and know that I'm not going to be judged. Otherwise, learning will not take place and you'll get colleagues not wanting to talk about their experience. So psychological safety is very important. And the other thing that I want to think about when you watch this video is the tell me what I'm thinking question. And you're probably wondering, what the hell is that? But basically, it's a question that I always do this to my students. I ask them something and they could give me 100 answers. And they look at you with eyes that are this wide, as though they're a deer in spotlights. And they kind of, I know what's going through their head. What does she want? What does she want? It could be this, could be that, could be the next thing. Okay. So don't do that, because if you do that, you're moving them away from that psychological safety space. You need to actually sort of put it out there, tell them what you want, and then ask around it. And we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. Okay, can we start that video?
Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated.
All right, Mr. Bile, is it?
My friends call me Phlegm.
Uh-huh. Mr. Bile, can you tell me what you did wrong?
I fell down?
No, before that. Can anyone tell me Mr. Bile's big mistake? Anyone? Ugh. Let's take a look at the tape. Here we go. Right. There. See? The door. You left it wide open. And leaving the door open is the worst mistake any employee can make because...
It could let in a draft?
It could let in a child.
Oh, Mr. Waternews.
There's nothing more toxic or deadly than a human child. A single touch could kill you. Leave a door open and a child could walk right into this factory, right into the monster world. I won't do it.
Okay, so who picked up on the tell me what I'm thinking question? How many greens? No, come on, there can't only be two. Okay, so there were quite a few tell me what I'm thinking questions, and you can see those participants sitting in the headlights, initially reflected at poor old Mr. Flem or Monster Flem, and then redirected to the rest of the group who were as sort of not quite sure what to say and what to answer. And then, do you think that was a safe psychological space? No. Quite judgmental, wasn't it? Okay, very, very accusatory and very judgmental. So that's an example of what we don't want to do, and yet it is very often what we do. So a lot of the students are here, am I right? Greens. Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so what we've done at this stage is we have reflected a little bit on this exercise. We've tried to break down to understand what debriefing is about, and what I've tried to do is get you all on the same sort of mental model. And that's quite an important part of the debriefing process. So I'll use an example of a 4-year-old child who's admitted to emergency centre with stridor. There's a bit of a history. They were at a birthday party. They've known peanut allergy, and they've been eating all sorts of odds and ends. And you start getting involved in this difficult airway management scenario. As you auscultate, you hear that there's not only stridor, but there's also a bit of a wheeze. So some of you are now thinking this is a foreign body, some of you are thinking this is an anaphylaxis, and some of you might be thinking that this is an asthma. And it could be one or a number of those things. So if we don't actually get to the party and we don't share that same mental model, we're going to treat our patients differently. So getting onto that same mental model is very, very important. And one of the ways that we do that is by the reactions phase. So there are 3 phases of a debriefing that we're going to go through. And the first is to elicit what the people are thinking, what they're feeling actually initially, and then what they're thinking. And I'm not going to go through the whole debriefing process because it's quite involved and quite long. But basically, we're going to go through reactions, how they're feeling, emotions, what they're thinking. I've written on the slide deactivation and diffusing phase as well, because different tools use different wording, and yet they're all basically the same type of thing. The next thing is we need to develop an understanding. For that, we need to have that shared mental model. And we're going to then start deconstructing and discovering what's going on in the different participants' minds. And the final thing that we're going to do is we're going to start developing solutions and resolve what the problem is, deepen the understanding, etc. So there are a couple of different tools that we can use, and one of them is pulls, and no, it does not mean pupils are equal and reactive to light. Okay, so what it is promoting excellence and reflection for learning in simulation. So this is a simulation tool. This is a free open access tool. It's quite a nice tool to use. It's quite easy to use, and there's some extra information on the other side. I'm not going to go through the whole thing there, other than to say that you can see some of the things that I'm talking about over there: reactions, description, analysis, and then a little bit of a summary at the end of it. Rebecca alluded to our collaboration with Bristol. So David Grant, who has trained many of us in South Africa, I think, was originally an SU undergrad, and he has come back, and he was involved in the Bristol simulation group in the UK, and he came up with this I trust structure. And if you had to look at it very closely, you'd see that it's very, very similar to the PULS tool. And we're probably going to be basing our new course around the I trust. But having said that, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the PULS, and in fact, I kind of think it's easier to use. Why did that happen? Okay, so I'm not going to go through that. So one of the things that we need to do is, as we're going through our debriefing, we need to make sure that we do use good judgment when we're debriefing. So I talked about the judgment and being very judgmental and how it's going to frighten the participants away. We want to use good judgment. There are a number of seminal papers that were written by Jenny Rudolph and a couple of other people about debriefing. And in fact, that's on the Learn to Debrief site that Rebecca had talked about. And they've moved from non-judgmental debriefing to debriefing with good judgment, because you are actually judging. You can't get away from it. You are. But there's a nice way of doing it without frightening people away. So in particular, how do I put this little pointer on? So at the bottom, underneath good judgment, help me to understand why you did X, Y, Z. So that's the sort of thing. It's not, and one of the reasons why we're doing that is because there may be a very, very good reason, a sound reason, why the person has done whatever you are thinking is incorrect. So when you get that what the F moment, what the F are they doing, what it actually is what is the frame, what are they thinking, what is their reasoning behind it. And that's what you really need to explore. So help me understand why you've done that. So I just want to talk a little bit, first of all, about sort of closing the knowledge gap and how we observe that and why it is important. So remember, as the instructor, you're going to be, or as the participant, or as the team leader, you're going to be observing and critiquing, and you're going to be looking at what the student performance is versus, and I say student because I've actually stolen this slide from Julia Blitz, who's our Vice Dean of Education. So, so she had it written down as student, it could be participant, it could be colleague. So we're looking at the actual performance versus what we would like the performance to have been. We're going to identify that gap. Is it a gap in knowledge? Is it a gap in skills? And we approach each one of those slightly differently. Is there a problem with teamwork and communication? So here we're going on to John Roessa's favorite topic. So CRM, or human factors. And then we need to develop an action plan of how we're going to close that. So how we're going to do that is with a bit of feedback. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the tools in the toolbox. Okay, so we have 3 tools, and I'm going to tell you about it, but you really will not become proficient with using those tools unless you go and read up a little bit more about it and start using them. So the first one is the hammer. And the hammer is very much deliberative feedback. So there is always try and draw in your learners or your participants and see if they can close the knowledge gap themselves. If they can't, you're going to go in with your deliberative tool and you're going to say, I noticed that you had a bit of a problem with airway management. Let's just quickly go through airway management. And you talk about it, or you might go back to doing a skill. The next tool that you're going to have is the wrench. So you're now wanting to tweak a little bit. Slowly but surely apply a little bit of pressure to all those nuts and close those nuts and bolts. Tighten them up a little bit. And that one, we use peer assisted learning for that. So you're basically going to open it up to everybody else. I noticed, Craig, that you seem to have an idea about how to manage that airway situation. Could you just tell us how you would have, what your approach would have been, or something like that, something to that effect. And then he steps in and he starts actually teaching the rest of the group himself. And then finally, we have the power tool. Okay, the power tool is advocacy with inquiry or facilitated reflection. It is the reason why I've called it a power tool. It's very, very powerful, particularly for human factors, debriefing, communication, any of those sort of skills. So you're using it with an experienced team, so people that know what they're doing, and you're starting to look at the more subtle problems that might have occurred within the team. The problem with advocacy with inquiry is that it is like using a power tool. It's very easy to switch it on, but you could very easily hit that electrical cable that's hidden away. So quite a dangerous tool, really. And the way we do that is you would probe. So you're going to probe. Say, I noticed that you did such and that concerns me because it could lead to hypoxia. And help me to understand. So now we're looking for that framework. Help me to understand why you did what you did. Okay. And as I said, there's a very good chance that they might have a logical reason for doing what they've done. But the last slide, in fact, just about the last slide, is talking about clinical debrief. And this is a tool from Ben Simon's site, so Simulcast. Okay. And he's adapted the 3D model of debriefing, which was diffusing, discovering, and deepening. And he's used 3 different terms over there on the left-hand side. But he's broken it down into the hot debrief, so that immediate debrief after a resuscitation, where you're really trying to elicit responses. How did we feel during this debrief? Okay, I was frustrated. I was really embarrassed by what I did, etc., etc. And we can go through. You can actually have a look at this yourselves. And so initially a hot debrief, then we go into a cold debrief, which should happen about a few days to a few weeks later. And you may or may not need this. Okay, but there may be 1 or 2 team members that need a bit of follow-up. And don't forget about those poor team members. And the same with the ice-cold debrief. We're now looking at it months later. We've perhaps needed to intervene with some teaching strategies to close gaps. and we've been through all of that. So my take-home messages is, first of all, safety first. You need to look at what you're trying to achieve, try to explore, identify knowledge gaps, close them. You use the 3 tools, and then you finally wrap it all up and give your participants 2 or 3 or 4 messages to take home. Okay, so don't just leave them hanging in the air. It's quite a long process, this debriefing. We're continually exploring, we're continually sharing our mental model, and then we are closing that gap. So resources, very similar to Rebecca's resources. And I agree with you, those podcasts are absolutely superb. Also on the Simulcast website, Ben Simon has a monthly journal club where he looks at articles, and then people from all over the world, the doyens of debrief, get involved in discussion, and really great. And then I know that EM, you love your Twitter. So those are some of the people. Socratic EM is Victoria Brazil from Australia. We have David Grant Sim over there. We have Get Curious Now, which is Jenny Rudolph. I alluded to her talks, her papers. And then Adam Cheng, who's an amazing debriefer, and Walter Epic. Okay, thanks.